It began with a scent of myrrh, sweet, sickly, and ancient. When the groundskeeper of St. Catherine's Convent pushed open the warped wooden door to the abbey's cellar, he expected the usual dampness, the old wine barrels, the mold that clung to the stones like sorrow. Instead, the air was thick with incense and something else, something metallic. He carried only a lantern, its trembling light quivering against the vaulted ceiling as he descended. The walls sweated. Drips echoed like slow heartbeats. Then the light caught on something pale, a discarded habit, folded too neatly on the steps. Beneath it, the faint outline of bare feet, calloused and cold. In the dim pool of light lay Sister Agnes Thibault, her body limp and wrapped in the sheets of her own bed linen, a wooden crucifix pressed to her chest. She was breathing barely. Her lips moved in prayer, or delirium. It was hard to tell. But what stopped the groundskeeper's breath was not her condition. It was the infant. Swaddled beside her, mewling weakly, was a newborn child. The rosary tangled around its tiny wrist shimmered like an accusation. The doctor summoned that evening wrote in his logbook that the woman, age 51, had borne a child under mysterious and improbable conditions. The abbess refused to let the constable question her. The church sealed the cellar and called for silence. 3 days later, Sister Agnes announced that the child was a blessing from the Lord himself, and the whispers began. It would take less than a month for that small Kentucky town to drown in scandal, and for the Vatican's shadow to creep across its cobbled streets. Beneath the hymnals and confessions, the truth festered. The father was not divine at all, but a young man bound in servitude to the convent, a boy who had never known freedom nor sin, until Sister Agnes called his touch holy. By the time the truth clawed its way into the light, 2 would be dead. 1 would vanish forever, and the walls of St. Catherine's would weep with more than rainwater. Before we continue with the story of Sister Agnes Thibault and the child she called her miracle, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1847. Kentucky was young then, a state split between faith and fever. Lexington's streets were lined with horse carts, their iron wheels biting through the frost. The war with Mexico raged far to the south, yet the air here was heavy with another kind of unrest. Slavery remained the lifeblood of the tobacco fields. Churches rose like monuments to guilt, their bells tolling both salvation and hypocrisy. St. Catherine's Convent stood on the outskirts of Harrowsfield, a town too small for maps but large enough to breed secrets. The convent itself was built in 1808 by French missionaries fleeing the Revolution, carved into the limestone hills that overlooked the river. Its architecture was severe, tall spires, narrow corridors, the kind of place where silence felt like the law. Every morning before dawn, the bells of St. Catherine's called the sisters to prayer. The sound rolled across the valley, mingling with the distant caws of crows and the low rumble of slave wagons headed for the plantations beyond town. The convent housed 19 women, ranging in age from 16 to 70, and was known for its strict observance of chastity and devotion. The abbess, Mother Marjorie, was said to have once walked barefoot through a blizzard to purge the flesh of comfort. They took in the sick, the orphaned, and, quietly, the unwanted daughters of the local gentry. Harrowsfield itself was a place where time felt sluggish. Its main street was a single muddy ribbon lined with taverns, a small apothecary, and the blacksmith's forge. At its heart stood the church, a whitewashed structure with cracked stained glass depicting the Virgin and Child, yet even the holy shimmered faintly with decay. The paint peeled from the altar rails. Rats scurried beneath the pews during the evening mass. Behind the church ran the servants' quarters, wooden shacks where indentured workers and enslaved men slept after tending the convent's gardens mending its fences or polishing its pews. Among them was a young man known only as Elias. He was 19. Elias had been purchased by the parish from a tobacco farm near Danville. No one knew his surname. He rarely spoke. Those who saw him said his eyes had the quiet sadness of a man twice his age. He worked mostly in the orchards, pruning the convent's apple trees and hauling barrels of holy water from the riverbank. The nuns spoke to him only through the kitchen door, all except one. Sister Agnes Thibault. Born in New Orleans in 1796, she was the daughter of a shipbuilder and had entered the order at 16. By her 50s, she had become a relic of the old church, disciplined, educated, and austere. Yet, beneath her solemn exterior lingered something else. Parishioners described her as possessed of visions. Others said she spoke to angels in the dark. Her letters to the abbess, many later seized as evidence, spoke of voices in the garden and a presence behind the chapel veil. In one note dated January 1846, she wrote, "There is a light that visits me when I pray at night. It is not of this earth. It tells me the Lord's promise is not yet fulfilled, that I am chosen to bring forth his renewal." The abbess dismissed it as poetic fancy. But in the months that followed, Sister Agnes began to isolate herself. She fasted until she fainted during Mass. She stopped eating meat, and she spent hours alone in the orchard, where Elias worked. Locals began to whisper of strange music drifting from the convent grounds after sunset. A low, mournful hum, sometimes joined by the sound of a man's voice, though no men were allowed within the walls after dusk. In town, people joked nervously that the sisters were marrying ghosts. But beneath the laughter, there was unease. Faith here was a fragile thing. The mid-19th century was a time when religion clung to the throat of America like a fever dream. Across the country, revivals and awakenings swept through towns, preaching salvation through visions and miracles. But the same fervor that lit the tents of preachers also burned the edges of reason. Women who spoke of divine visitations were either sainted or condemned. A nun claiming immaculate conception would not be met with awe, but with suspicion, fear, and the cold machinery of the Church's discipline. Yet Sister Agnes would do more than claim it. She would insist that her pregnancy was the manifest will of heaven. In her first recorded statement to the diocesan vicar, she said, "The Lord came to me in the form of light. He spoke through a humble servant and filled me with his purpose. This child is not of man's making." The priest noted in his margin, "She trembles when she says this. The eyes are wild, possible delirium or possession." But not everyone in Harrowsfield dismissed her. Some whispered that miracles often come cloaked in scandal. Others said the Church had buried stranger truths before. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier that winter. The convent's bell tower went silent, and the boy, Elias, was no longer seen working the orchard. No one asked where he'd gone. For months, the convent gates remained locked, and then came the night of the crying child. When the midwife was finally allowed to enter, she later testified that the birth room smelled of iron and candle smoke. The walls were smeared with oil. On the floor beside the bed, a single word was written in Latin: "Fiat." "Let it be done." She said Sister Agnes smiled as she handed her the infant, whispering, "He is not mine. He belongs to the light." That child's cry would echo far beyond those stone walls. It would reach the bishop's office in Louisville. It would stain reputations, end lives, and carve St. Catherine's into the annals of American religious scandal. Because when the truth came, when the real father's name emerged, it would not only shatter faith, it would test the very idea of divine justice. The records of Harrowsfield are fragile things, ink-stained pages kept in cedar boxes, names written in hands too careful to trust. But from these remnants, we can still piece together the souls at the heart of the story: the nun who defied heaven, the boy who bore its blame, and those who tried and failed to keep their silence. The first was Sister Agnes Thibault. By the winter of 1846, she had become a legend within the convent. Her devotion was severe, yet her voice carried a warmth that softened even the coldest hearts. Parish children remembered her hymns, sung not from the choir loft but from the chapel floor, barefoot, eyes lifted toward the crucifix as though she could see through it. Her face was angular, pale from years of candlelight, her dark hair tucked tightly beneath her wimple, but her eyes, gray, almost translucent, had a way of unsettling those who met them. It wasn't madness one saw there, not at first glance. It was conviction. A visiting priest once wrote, "Sister Agnes prays not as one asking for mercy, but as one demanding a revelation. It is a dangerous kind of faith, too loud, too sure." Agnes had lived through more than most of her sisters. She had survived yellow fever in New Orleans, ministered to the dying along the Mississippi, and buried half her family before she turned 30. When she came to Kentucky, she brought with her a quiet intensity, an obsession, some said, with the Virgin's purity. But the human heart, even wrapped in vows, does not forget the sound of touch. In her letters to the abbess, she described Elias not by name, but by light. The servant walks as though heaven rests upon his shoulders. When he labors, the sun seems to follow him. At first her fascination appeared harmless, spiritual, perhaps even maternal. She tended his wounds when he cut his hand on the orchard shears. She taught him the Lord's Prayer, slow and patient, tracing the sign of the cross on his brow. To her, he was a soul to be lifted. To him, she was a voice from a world that had always looked through him. Then there was Elias, the young man at the center of it all. He had been born on a plantation near Danville, to a mother who died when he was 6. His owner, a tobacco merchant, had sold him to the church in exchange for absolution from certain debts. It was not an uncommon transaction in those years. The church, though pious in word, was often practical in deed. Elias had known only labor. He spoke softly, with the slight drawl of the South and the hesitation of a man taught that words could be dangerous. His skin was the color of coffee steeped in milk, his frame lean from work, his hands perpetually raw. Sister Beatrice, one of the younger nuns, later recalled, "He never raised his eyes when spoken to, but there was something gentle about him, like he feared to take up too much air." Elias slept in a small shack behind the convent stables, rising before dawn to draw water and tending to the orchard by day. It was said that Sister Agnes began leaving bread for him at the gate. Then notes, brief, careful phrases written in the margins of discarded hymnals. One such note, discovered years later during the convent's closure, read, "The Lord speaks through you. Do not fear his light." No one knows the moment when devotion turned to transgression. Some said it happened one stormy night when the river flooded and Elias was ordered to take shelter in the chapel basement. Others whispered that it began in confession when Agnes knelt before the wooden screen and found his voice on the other side instead of the priest's. Whatever the truth, by the spring of 1846, something had changed. The sisters noticed Agnes taking longer walks in the garden. She hummed softly under her breath, sometimes smiling without reason. Mother Marjorie, the abbess, saw the shift and wrote in her diary, "There is a new heat in Agnes's prayers. She trembles as though the Spirit moves within her, and yet I feel no peace when I stand beside her." Mother Marjorie herself was a formidable woman. At 68, she had ruled St. Catherine's for nearly 3 decades. Her authority was unchallenged, her faith absolute. She had the posture of a woman carved from marble, her face a map of discipline and denial. But beneath that iron exterior lay the terror of scandal, a fear that anything, even rumor, could unravel the order she had built. When Agnes first confided in her about her visions, Marjorie had warned her, "Do not mistake the whispers of the flesh for the word of God, child. Angels speak through obedience, not longing." Agnes had only smiled, replying softly, "Then perhaps obedience is not what heaven seeks of me." The abbess struck her then, not in anger, but in horror. To her, such words bordered on blasphemy, yet the seed had already been planted. There were others, too, who played their roles in silence. Sister Beatrice, young and fearful, was the first to suspect the truth. She saw Agnes in the orchard one morning, her hands trembling as she reached for Elias's arm. The gesture was small, almost tender, but in a place like St. Catherine's, even tenderness was forbidden. That night, Beatrice wrote to the abbess, "Forgive me, Mother, if I speak falsely, but Sister Agnes has grown strange. I think she keeps counsel with the servant boy. She says the light visits them both." The abbess burned the letter. Then there was Father Lucien Moreau, the parish priest assigned to oversee St. Catherine's, a French émigré. Lucien was a man torn between faith and fascination. He had heard rumors of mystical nuns before, visions, stigmata, miracles, but he had also seen deceit. When he heard of Agnes's divine pregnancy, he came to investigate. He described their first conversation in a letter to his bishop. "She looked at me as though she knew I doubted her. I asked who the Father was. She smiled and said, 'Would you question the Holy Spirit, Father?' I told her the Lord does not work in secrecy. Her reply chilled me. 'Then you have not watched him long enough.'" It was Lucien who first hinted that the child might not be divine at all, that the convent harbored a human sin beneath its habit. But by the time he made his suspicions known, the church had already begun its quiet inquiry. And then, of course, there was the town itself, Harrowsfield. In every story like this, the town is not just a setting, but a witness. Its people watched from behind shutters as the convent bells fell silent. They whispered in taverns and parlors. A nun with child was scandal enough, but the idea that the father might be one of their own servants, a man of color, bound and voiceless, was something else entirely. The shopkeeper's wife claimed to have seen Elias walking the road one night, pale in the moonlight, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The blacksmith swore he heard crying from the convent garden. The local doctor, Dr. Josiah Keene, told anyone who'd listened that the old nun's mind had turned from fasting. But even he couldn't explain how a woman of 51 could bear a healthy child. In his notes, later seized during the church's investigation, Keene wrote, "Her pulse is steady, the womb enlarged as though by youth. I can offer no rational account. Either she lies, or nature itself has bent to her will." It was in this atmosphere, suspended between faith and fear, that the horror began to root. Agnes's pregnancy could have been hidden longer if not for the fever that swept through the convent that summer. Several nuns fell ill, and the doctor was summoned. He noticed Agnes's condition immediately. When questioned, she clasped her hands and said simply, "I am chosen." The abbess confined her to her chamber, forbidding visitors, but the damage was done. The whispers spread through Harrowsfield faster than fire through hay. A child of God, a blasphemy, a miracle, a curse. To some, Sister Agnes was a new Virgin Mary, visited by the Holy Ghost. To others, she was a heretic, an old woman bewitched by lust. Elias vanished from the convent grounds soon after. Some said he fled in shame. Others claimed the church took him. A few whispered darker theories, that the boy had been silenced to preserve the sanctity of the sisterhood. Whatever the truth, his absence was final. No record of him exists after August of that year. In the months leading to the birth, Agnes's behavior became erratic. She spoke to the walls. She refused food for days, then demanded communion wine by the cup. One sister found her kneeling before the statue of the Virgin, whispering, "You were blessed without touch. I am blessed through it." By the time the child came, a boy, healthy and dark-skinned, the convent's fragile facade had shattered. The abbess ordered all external communication cut off. The birth was registered under the church's name, not the mother's. When word reached Father Lucien, he demanded access to the records. The abbess refused. Their argument, overheard by the sisters, turned nearly violent. "You will damn us all by your silence," Lucien cried. "Better silence than scandal," Marjorie replied. "Scandal is truth dressed in fear. And fear is what keeps the faithful from hell, Father." He left that night and never returned to the convent. Yet the truth could not be contained. In October of 1847, an anonymous letter reached the Louisville diocese, accusing the convent of foul impurity and blasphemous deception. The bishop sent investigators. By then, Agnes had already declared her child a miracle and begun calling him Emmanuel. Witnesses said she cradled the infant with a mother's tenderness, but when she spoke to him, it was in prophecy. "The world will hate you," she whispered, "as it hated him." And so the stage was set. A nun who believed herself chosen, a boy erased by the church, and a child born of sin or sanctity. It was only a matter of time before the veil of secrecy tore, and what lay behind it would make even the faithful tremble. The first thing they noticed was the silence. St. Catherine's had always been a place of bells. Bells for prayer, bells for meals, bells for death. Yet, in the weeks after the child's birth, those bells ceased to ring. Visitors from town would find the gate unlatched but the courtyard empty, as if the convent itself were holding its breath. The autumn wind swept dry leaves against the stone walls, and the chapel's windows, once luminous with hymns, became opaque with soot. Something had changed within those walls, something that no one could name aloud. Sister Beatrice, still young enough to believe in both miracles and monsters, was the first to sense it. She said the convent's air felt heavier, as though the prayers no longer reached heaven. The candles sputtered during morning mass. The statues wept condensation that left faint streaks across their marble cheeks. And every night, as the sisters knelt in their cells, they heard it. The sound of a child crying, faint but unrelenting, drifting through the halls like a ghost looking for its mother. At first, they told themselves it was only the wind. The stone corridors could play tricks on the ear. But then came the other noises. A soft humming, a woman's voice speaking words that were not Latin, not English, something older. The abbess forbade discussion of it. "The devil feeds on gossip," she told them. "Silence is our armor." But fear spreads faster than faith, and before long, even the novices began avoiding the nursery where Sister Agnes kept her child. It was said she never let him out of her sight. The infant slept at her side, even during prayer. When she walked the courtyard, she carried him close, wrapped in a white shawl. If another nun approached, she would turn away sharply, shielding the boy's face. Only Sister Beatrice dared to speak to her. One morning, as the mist clung to the orchard and the bells remained mute, Beatrice found Agnes sitting beneath an apple tree, her child cradled against her chest. "Mother Agnes," she whispered, using the title the sisters had begun to give her in secret, half mockery, half awe. "He's beautiful." Agnes looked up, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "Beauty is the sign of truth," she said softly, "and truth is never gentle." Beatrice hesitated. Do you know what they say in town?" Agnes smiled faintly. "They said the same of Mary." Beatrice swallowed. "And Elias?" The older nun's smile faltered. Her gaze drifted toward the tree line. "He has gone where angels walk." Beatrice's breath caught. "You mean he's Do not speak his name, Agnes interrupted sharply. Names bind the dead. The younger woman fled then, her heart pounding, certain she'd heard something she was never meant to. Later that night, Beatrice swore she saw a shadow moving in the orchard, a tall figure, barefoot, gliding between the trees. When she called out, it vanished, leaving only the smell of damp soil and something faintly sweet, like crushed apples. By the time dawn came, the tree under which Agnes had been sitting was found split in two, as though struck by lightning, but the sky had been clear all night. Rumors spread quickly beyond the convent's walls. Harrowsfield's townsfolk whispered that the sisters were practicing strange rites. A farmer passing the convent at dusk claimed he saw candles burning in the orchard, arranged in a circle. The apothecary's daughter swore she heard chanting in a language she'd never known. Father Lucien, though banished from the convent, began to keep a journal of these accounts. His entries grew increasingly frantic. The women believe themselves holy, but I have seen holiness twisted before. The church hides the child, but the truth cannot stay buried. Elias is gone, perhaps murdered, perhaps worse. The nun speaks of visions of light, yet her eyes are the color of graves. Inside the convent, the sisters began to sicken. One by one, they fell into fever. Their dreams were filled with water, they said, water rising in the chapel, cold and black, swallowing the altar whole. Sister Margaret, the convent's oldest nun, confessed before she died that she'd seen the child crawl from his cradle one night and stand at the foot of her bed. His eyes were open, she whispered, but they were not his own. The abbess dismissed it as delirium. A child cannot walk at 6 months, she insisted. And certainly not into your room, sister. But when they found Margaret's body the next morning, her crucifix was missing, and the window above her bed had been unlatched. The other sisters began sleeping in pairs. They carried candles through the corridors, whispering prayers not found in any catechism. Even Mother Marjorie's hands trembled when she wrote her nightly journal. It is as though the walls themselves are breathing. Agnes prays in strange tongues. The child never cries when she speaks to him, only when others draw near. Sometimes I think I see movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of white cloth, a shape that is not there when I turn. I have begun to dream of water, too. Outside, the townsfolk grew restless. When the church sent word that no visitors were to approach St. Catherine's, suspicion hardened into fear. Farmers refused to sell their goods to the convent. The blacksmith's wife crossed herself whenever the Abbey bell tower came into view. And in the midst of this dread, a letter arrived for the abbess, sealed in red wax and bearing the sigil of the archdiocese. The message was brief. A representative of the Holy Office will arrive within the fortnight to investigate matters of faith and conduct. Prepare the house and all within it for inspection. The abbess read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, set it beside her Bible, and whispered, "God forgive us all." That night, the convent silence was broken by a scream. The sisters rushed to the nursery, candles trembling in their hands. Inside, they found Sister Agnes kneeling beside the crib, the sheets soaked through with blood. The child was wailing. Agnes's face was pale, her hands streaked with red. "It's not his," she said softly when the abbess demanded to know what happened. "It's mine." Her wrists bore shallow cuts, the skin beneath her habit raw from scratching. She smiled faintly, as though in revelation. "He wanted to feed. I could not deny him." The abbess tore the child from her arms. "You are not well, Agnes," she said. "The devil tests you." But Agnes only laughed, a low, broken sound. "Then let him. Even the devil bends to light." The next morning she was confined to her cell. The door was locked. Yet each night after, the sisters heard her singing. Not hymns, but lullabies, soft, melodic, and strange. The melody wound through the stone halls like a spell. One novice swore she saw a faint glow beneath Agnes's door. Another claimed she heard a man's voice singing with her, deep and mournful. When the inquisitor finally arrived, a Jesuit priest named Father Antonius Calvi, he found the convent in disarray. The sisters were pale and trembling. The abbess, once iron-willed, had begun to drink. And Agnes? Agnes greeted him with a smile. "You've come to see the miracle," she said. Antonius was not easily shaken. He had investigated cases of supposed possession and false prophecy across 3 continents. He looked at Agnes and saw not sanctity, but illness. "I've come," he replied, "to discern the truth." Agnes tilted her head. "Then you will have to listen closely. The truth does not shout. It whispers." He interviewed each sister. Their testimonies were consistent in their fear, but divided in belief. Some swore they had witnessed divine light during Agnes's prayers. Others said they had seen the child's eyes gleam red in the candlelight. Antonius wrote in his report, "This is no ordinary delusion. The mother's influence extends beyond reason. The community lives in submission to her visions. It is as though faith itself has curdled." On his 3rd night, he stayed awake in the chapel, hoping to catch the source of the whispers that plagued the sisters' sleep. At midnight, he heard footsteps, not heavy but bare and deliberate. They moved past him, toward the nursery. When he followed, the air grew cold. The door stood open. Inside, the cradle was empty. Sister Agnes knelt beside it, her hands clasped in prayer. "Where is the child?" Antonius demanded. She turned slowly, her face serene. "He walks with his father." The priest felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Elias?" he whispered. Agnes smiled, the one who carried light into darkness. At dawn, the child was found asleep in the chapel, resting at the foot of the cross. How he had gotten there, no one knew. Antonius sealed his report, labeling it "Case of probable diabolic influence, subject to immediate intervention." The church would decide what came next. But before any decision could be made, something terrible happened. 2 days later, the abbess was found dead in her study. Her body slumped over her desk, her eyes wide open, her rosary clutched so tightly the beads had cut into her palm. The Bible before her was open to the book of Revelation. The words beneath her hand read, "And the woman was clothed with the sun." Sister Beatrice swore she heard laughter echo through the halls that night, laughter that did not sound human. By morning, Father Antonius was gone. His horse remained tethered at the gate, his belongings untouched. The convent was sealed the next day, and Sister Agnes, with her child, was never seen again. The church's records end there, but Harrowsfield's did not. For years after, townsfolk claimed to see a woman in white walking the orchard, a baby in her arms. The trees, they said, bore no fruit after that winter. Some said the child grew up and lived among them under another name. Others said he was buried beneath the convent floor, his grave marked only by a stone that still glows faintly under the moonlight. Whatever the truth, one thing remained certain. The light that Agnes had called divine had left a shadow that Harrowsfield would never escape. The winter that followed was unlike any Harrowsfield had seen. Snow came early, thick and unrelenting, muffling the town in silence. The river froze to glass. Horses died in their stables. Chimneys smoked black, and people began to whisper that God himself had turned his face away. The convent, now sealed by decree of the archdiocese, stood like a mausoleum on the hill. Its windows were shuttered, its chapel bell removed. The priests who arrived from Louisville forbade the townsfolk to approach. They spoke of purification, of sanctity restored, but they never explained what, exactly, had been purified. No one saw Sister Agnes again. Officially, the church claimed she had been transferred to a monastery of seclusion in Pennsylvania. Yet no such record ever appeared. The convent's servants were dismissed, their wages paid in silence. The orchard was burned, and the ground where the abbess was buried remained untouched until the thaw. When spring came, so did the smell. It started faintly, like spoiled wine, then ripened into something unbearable. The new caretaker, a man named Hiram Walsh, followed it to the base of the orchard hill, where the soil had been disturbed. He dug only a few inches before he found the bones, not of one, but of two. The sheriff was called.
Between March and
the church
November of
intervened,
1849,
and
17
once again,
male slaves
Harrowsfield
from the
became the
house
center of a
streets,
scandal no one dared name aloud.
prominent families.
The coroner's
Records
report,
show they were sold
preserved
to
only in
distant
fragments,
plantations,
described the remains as
contained
female, approximate age 50, and juvenile, possibly newborn. Both were buried together, wrapped in linen bearing the insignia of St. Catherine's. No coffin, no cross. The church denied any connection. The deceased are likely paupers interred prior to the convent's founding, a bishop's aide insisted. Yet everyone in town knew better. The same week, the town's apothecary, Mr. Keene, received a visitor, a young man with a face that seemed carved from sorrow. He asked for mercury, claiming he needed it for pest control. When Keene refused, the man grew agitated. "She told me to bring her light," he murmured. "She said the light needs feeding." Keene reported the encounter to the sheriff, who dismissed it as madness. But when he described the young man's appearance, slender, dark-skinned, with a scar across his right hand, the old men in town exchanged uneasy glances. "Elias," someone whispered. It was impossible, of course. Elias had been gone nearly a year, but the rumors flared again, burning hotter than before. At the tavern, the blacksmith swore he saw a lantern flicker in the convent tower one night, long after the priests had left. The ferryman claimed he heard a woman's voice singing from the riverbank, a lullaby in a language he didn't know. And then came the letters. They arrived at the rectory one by one, each written in the same looping feminine hand. No name, no return address, only scripture woven with madness. "He is the dawn. He is the vessel. You buried him, but did not bury what he carries." The church is blind to its own prophecy. I have walked with the light, and it is not gentle. The blood sings beneath the stones. Come, Father, and listen. The handwriting was confirmed to be Sister Agnes's. Father Lucien, now stripped of his parish for inflammatory conduct, begged the diocese to reopen the investigation. They ignored him, so he went to Harrowsfield himself. He arrived in June under the pretext of visiting an old friend. Those who saw him said he looked aged beyond his years, his hair graying, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He carried a satchel of books, Bible, journal, and a pistol. He stayed at the apothecary's house. The first night he dreamt of the convent bells ringing. When he awoke, his host swore no bells had sounded in months. Lucien walked the orchard the next morning. The trees, though burned, still stood in blackened rows. At the center of the hill, he found a small cairn of stones. One bore a mark carved crudely into its surface, a cross turned upside down. He knelt. The soil beneath was still soft. In his journal he wrote, "If this is her grave, then something restless sleeps here. I feel watched. The air hums, as though the earth itself remembers her voice." That evening he visited the caretaker. Hiram Walsh was a nervous man, prone to drink, his hands always shaking. He told Lucien of strange lights in the chapel, greenish and flickering, as though from a lantern that burned beneath the floor. "I sealed the doors," Walsh said, "but every dawn they're open again, and there's footprints, bare ones, small like a child's, across the dust." Lucian convinced him to take him there. The chapel was colder than the rest of the ruins. Its pews were overturned, its altar stripped bare, yet the crucifix still hung above the pulpit, blackened by smoke. In the center of the floor lay a circle of stones, charred and cracked, as if something had once burned within it. Lucien bent to examine them. In the ash, faintly visible, was a single word: Fiat. He felt his breath catch. It was the same word written on the walls during the birth, the word Sister Agnes had spoken in her delirium. Let it be done. As he turned to leave, he heard it, a soft cooing sound, like a baby's. It came from beneath the floor. Walsh backed away, muttering prayers. Lucien knelt again, pressing his ear to the ground. The sound grew louder, then faded into something else, a low hum, almost like a chant. He rose, pale and trembling. "Seal it," he said. "Whatever is beneath us, seal it and never open it again." But of course they did. Within a week, boys from the town broke into the chapel out of curiosity. They pried up the floorboards where the sound had been heard. What they found sent one of them screaming into the night. The sheriff described it only as remains of an unholy sort. The church ordered immediate reburial and exorcism rites, but word spread nonetheless. Some said they found bones arranged in a circle, each marked with symbols no one could read. Others claimed it was just one skeleton, that of a woman clutching something small to her chest. Whatever they saw, it changed Harrowsfield. The townspeople began to leave in quiet succession. Farms were sold for pennies. The ferryman abandoned his post. Even the sheriff resigned, claiming this place has forgotten God. And through it all, Father Lucian stayed. He spent his days wandering the convent ruins, collecting fragments, pages of hymnals, pieces of stained glass, and once, a child's wooden rosary. He believed these objects held answers, that if he could piece together the story, he could understand how faith had turned into something monstrous. His final entry, dated September 4th, 1848, reads, "The child was not of heaven nor of hell, but of man's own hunger for meaning. We made God in our image and then cursed him for looking back." He disappeared that same night. His room was found empty, his journal left open on the desk. In its margin, someone, perhaps not him, had written a single line in faint, uneven script. "The light walks still." By autumn, Harrowsfield was nearly deserted. A single caretaker remained at the convent, tasked with maintaining the grounds for potential reopening. He lasted 6 weeks. In his resignation letter, he wrote that he heard footsteps in the nave when there were none, and smelled candle wax though no candles burned. When his replacement arrived, the first man refused to set foot inside the chapel. "It isn't the dead you'll fear," he told him. "It's the living things that learned how to pray." The new caretaker, a quiet Irishman named Callum Ward, dismissed it as superstition. But on his second night, as he patrolled the orchard, he saw a woman standing among the charred trees. She was barefoot, dressed in white, holding something wrapped in cloth. He called out. The figure turned, and in the moonlight he saw her face, gaunt, pale, and unmistakably human. She smiled once, then faded into the mist. Callum left before dawn, his mind fractured by what he'd seen. When asked later to describe her, he said, "It was like seeing grief made flesh, but her eyes, they weren't sorrowful. They were proud." For decades after, no one dared live near St. Catherine's Hill. The ruin sank slowly into the earth, swallowed by ivy and silence. Yet, every so often, travelers passing through would claim to hear bells ringing faintly in the distance, though no church stood within miles. In 1889, a new parish attempted to reclaim the land. The priests sent to bless the foundation found their holy water turned red overnight. they abandoned the site. By the turn of the century, Harrowsfield itself was gone, erased from maps. Its few surviving families relocated inland. Only the convent remained, its stones crumbling, its chapel door chained. And still, on certain winter nights, the villagers in the nearest township say the hill glows faintly, like a lantern buried underground. One archivist from the Diocese of Louisville, Father Raymond Kell, took an interest in the case in 1912. He gathered what little evidence survived, letters, testimonies, reports, and compiled them into a single volume labeled De Mulieribus Lucis, The Woman of Light. He wrote, "What happened at St. Catherine's was not possession nor miracle, but the collision of two hungers, faith and flesh. One sought to rise beyond sin, the other to sanctify it. When they met, the world could not hold them both." To this day, the Church refuses to comment. But one page, found loose among Father Kell's archives, bears handwriting no one could identify. It reads simply, "He will walk again when the orchard blooms." And for those who live near the ruins, that is the fear that lingers every spring, when the trees, blackened for generations, suddenly show signs of life. What do you think? Were these guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of a madness born from faith itself? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. There are certain stories that refuse to stay buried. No matter how much dirt you lay upon them, no matter how many prayers you whisper over their graves, they find their way back to the surface, quietly, patiently, like bones rising through thawing earth. The story of Sister Agnes Thibault was one of them. By the early 1900s, St. Catherine's was nothing more than a ruin, but the memory of its scandal had taken root in the soil. The locals called the place the Mother's Orchard. Hunters avoided it. Children dared each other to sleep one night within its walls, though none ever did. They said the air there carried a hum, a vibration, like the faint ringing of a bell far underground. It was around that time that the Louisville Gazette sent a reporter named Henry Vail to investigate the old legend. He was 32, a rationalist by all accounts, a man who believed every ghost story could be explained by weather, madness, or the human need to believe in something greater than ourselves. He arrived in Harrowsfield in the spring of 1908, when the valley was half drowned from a season of relentless rain. The town, what remained of it, consisted of a few shacks and a church that hadn't held mass in decades. The road to the convent was little more than mud and memory. The trees that lined it leaned inward as though whispering warnings. Vail carried only a notebook and a Kodak camera. His editor wanted a piece of local folklore, a Southern Gothic curiosity for the Sunday readers. He expected old wives' tales, not history's residue. When he reached the ruins, he described what he saw in his first article draft. The convent stands like a broken rib against the hillside, its chapel roof caved in, its bell tower tilting toward the earth. The stones sweat moisture, and the air smells faintly of apples, though none grow here anymore. Vail was not a man easily moved by superstition, yet he admitted something about the place unsettled him. In his journal, not the newspaper copy, but the private ledger found decades later in his estate, he wrote, "I thought I heard a woman singing. It came from beneath the chapel floor, faint, lilting, and unbearably sad. I called out, but the sound stopped as if it were listening back." That night, Vail took a room in what passed for Harrowsfield's only boarding house. Its owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Durnell, remembered the scandal vividly. "My grandmother was a novice there," she told him, pouring tea that smelled faintly of cloves. "She said Sister Agnes was touched by something not of this world. They said she bore a child, though she was barren as the moon. When the church found out, they took her away. But some say she never left." Vail leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Durnell's eyes darted toward the window, where rain streaked the glass like tears. You can still hear her on the nights when the orchard stirs. She calls for him, the boy, and he answers. Vale smiled politely. You mean Elias? The old woman's spoon froze halfway to her lips. How do you know that name? It's in the diocesan records, Vale said. The servant accused of impropriety. Mrs. Darnell set the spoon down with a trembling hand. Records lie, sir. But names, remember. The next day, he returned to the ruins. The air was heavy, the clouds hanging low enough to touch. As he crossed what had once been the courtyard, his boot caught on something half buried in the mud, a small wooden crucifix, splintered but intact. The initials A.T. were carved faintly on its back. He pocketed it. Inside the chapel, the light came in slivers through the broken roof. The altar had collapsed, revealing a hollow cavity beneath. Vale crouched, running his hand along the stones. They were marked, tiny scratches, symbols like suns with too many rays. He took a photograph. The plate would later develop with strange distortions, faint streaks of light forming a circle, as though the air itself had tried to write something. He stayed until dusk, scribbling notes. Then, just as he prepared to leave, he heard footsteps. Slow, bare, coming from behind the altar. He turned, heart hammering, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. A woman in white, her face half hidden by shadow. "Hello?" he called. She didn't answer. Vale took a cautious step forward. "Are you from the parish? Do you live here?" The woman tilted her head slightly, as though puzzled by the question. The light from his lantern caught her face, and he saw it clearly for the first time. Her features were sharp, her skin pale, her eyes gray, almost translucent. She smiled faintly. "You came to see the light." Her voice was soft but carried through the chapel like wind through a grave. Vale swallowed. "Who are you?" But she only raised a finger to her lips. "Listen." From somewhere deep below, beneath the cracked floor and cold stone, came a sound, like a baby's cry. When he looked back at her, she was gone. He left that night, shaken but resolute. The rational mind clings to explanation, even when the world refuses to yield one. In his second journal entry, Vale wrote, "There must be a logical cause, perhaps echoing from the river tunnels beneath the hill. The woman, some local hermit perhaps. Still, her voice stays with me." He returned again the next morning, this time bringing a shovel and rope. He intended to descend into the hollow beneath the altar. He told himself he was seeking truth, but truth in that place was a living thing, and it was waiting for him. It took him an hour to break through the stone. Beneath lay a narrow stair, carved directly into the bedrock, descending into blackness. The air that wafted up was damp and cold, tinged with something sweet and rotten, the unmistakable smell of decay. He descended slowly, lantern held before him. At the bottom was a small chamber. The walls were lined with rough-hewn alcoves, each containing bones, skulls and femurs stacked neatly like relics. But at the center of the room stood something stranger still, a wooden cradle, empty. He approached it, his lantern trembling. Etched into the cradle's rim was a single word, Emmanuel. Vale recoiled. That was the name from the old church records, the name Sister Agnes had given her child. Suddenly, the air shifted. His lantern flickered, dimmed, and then went out. In the darkness, something moved. He felt it before he heard it. A presence, a change in the air, like a hand resting against his chest. Then came the faintest whisper, close to his ear. "He still walks." When Vale stumbled back into daylight, he was pale and shaking. His camera had shattered. His hands were streaked with dust and blood, though he had no wound. He left Harrowsfield that evening, swearing never to return. His article never made print. The Gazette received only a brief note. The convent's ruin is real. Its silence is earned. Publish nothing. Burn what you have. But Vale's private journal survived. 2 months later, his landlady found him dead in his boarding room in Louisville. The coroner ruled it suicide, though no weapon was found. His eyes were open, and on the wall above his desk, someone had written in charcoal, "Fiat." Time marched on, as it always does, eroding memory into rumor. Yet St. Catherine's continued to infect those who sought to explain it. In 1923, a team of historians from the University of Kentucky attempted to excavate the site for anthropological study. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Edward Alcott, dismissed the local warnings as folk hysteria. They lasted 3 days. On the 4th, one of his assistants vanished. Her tent was found torn open, her footprints leading toward the orchard and ending abruptly, as though she had been lifted from the ground. Alcott shut down the dig and fled the site. In his field notes, later archived at the university, he wrote, "We unearthed a series of child-sized coffins beneath the chapel foundation. Each contained stones instead of bones, each wrapped in linen marked with the same symbol, a circle of rays. When the last coffin was opened, the air turned so cold our breath froze mid-speech. Then we heard it, a heartbeat, faint but steady, from beneath the soil." The project was never resumed. As decades passed, the church quietly purchased the land once more. The ruins were fenced off. Private property, no trespassing. But fences cannot keep out memory. Every few years, a traveler reports seeing lights atop the hill. One described them as lanterns moving in procession. Another, a truck driver in 1956, said he saw a nun walking the road, barefoot, carrying something that cried. And then, in 1978, construction began on a new road near Harrowsfield. While clearing the hillside, workers unearthed a sealed stone chamber. Inside were human remains, at least 7 individuals, most adult women, 1 infant. The site foreman, a Catholic himself, refused to continue. The bones were reinterred quietly, without ceremony, under church supervision. But one worker, years later, described what he saw. They were all facing upward, like they were waiting for something to come down. The church offered no comment. The newspapers barely covered it. But for those who remembered the name, Agnes Thibault, it was enough to stir old dread. If you visit the area today, there's little left of Harrowsfield. The valley is quiet. The road ends at a fence of rusted iron, and beyond it lies a hollow where the convent once stood. The apple trees, though long dead, bloom some springs, briefly, brilliantly, against all natural reason. Locals say the blossoms smell not of fruit, but of incense and blood. And sometimes, just before dawn, when the mist rolls low, a faint voice can be heard singing among the branches. He walks with the light. He walks with the light. When faith becomes hunger, it devours what it touches. When the sacred is mixed with the profane, it leaves behind something neither human nor divine. The story of Sister Agnes Thibault was not just the scandal of a nun and her servant. It was a mirror, showing how far the church would go to silence what it could not explain, and how deep the human soul would dig to sanctify its own desires. Even now, the church's archives contain sealed files marked Harrowsfield Anomaly. No one outside the Vatican has ever read them. But a letter preserved in a private collection, unsigned, undated, but written on papal stationery, offers one chilling line. If the child still lives, he will not age as we do. His light will not fade. And so, the legend endures. Some say he walks the back roads of Kentucky still, a man with gray eyes and a voice that makes candles flicker. Others say he was never human at all, that he was the last proof that divinity, once called down by human hands, can never be put back. So what do you think? Was Sister Agnes a vessel for something holy, or something far darker? Was Elias a victim of her delusion, or the unwilling father of something not meant for this world? Tell us below. Crime or miracle? Blasphemy or divine birth? Your theories matter here. They say the deeper you dig into the earth, the closer you get to heaven, or to whatever lies beneath it. Yet, when the final pieces of the St. Catherine's mystery began to surface, it wasn't through priests or historians, but through a discovery no one was supposed to make. It was 1992. The state of Kentucky had authorized a small archaeological survey in preparation for a new highway. The Harrowsfield tract was classified as historically sensitive, but not sacred, at least not in the official sense. The research team was young, ambitious, and largely secular. To them, the convent was just another ruin. The lead investigator was Dr. Evelyn Hart, a professor of religious anthropology at Vanderbilt. She was brilliant, skeptical, and famously fearless. Her colleagues called her the nun hunter because she specialized in uncovering buried convents, monasteries, and ossuaries across the American South. When her team arrived, the ruins of St. Catherine's had almost vanished. The chapel was a jagged skeleton of stone. The orchard was long dead, save for one tree, twisted, black, yet somehow still living, its roots breaking through the old chapel floor. They set up camp nearby, planning to excavate the crypt beneath the altar, the same place where, a century earlier, Henry Vale had heard a baby's cry. The first week was uneventful. They catalogued broken rosaries, burnt prayer books, and fragments of bone that seemed centuries older than the convent itself. But then, one of the graduate students uncovered a small wooden box sealed with wax. Inside were folded pages, half-burned, written in French and Latin. They were signed A. Thibault. Dr. Hart read them that night by lantern light. The ink was faint, but the words were unmistakable. He grows without hunger, he sleeps without breath. His eyes open before the dawn, and when he looks upon me, I see the end of all things. Another page. The voice speaks no longer through light but through blood. It tells me I was chosen not to bear salvation, but remembrance. He is not of God. He is what remains when faith turns inside out. The team dismissed it as the ravings of a sick woman. Hart wasn't so sure. In her journal she wrote, "Every legend hides a human truth, but sometimes I wonder if the truth hides something less human. This woman, Agnes, believed utterly in what she carried, and belief, when fed by solitude and guilt, can create its own miracles." The next morning, the crew broke into the lower vault. The air that came out was ancient and cold, their lights cut through centuries of dust. What they found inside stopped them all. At the center of the chamber was a wooden cradle, untouched by rot. It sat directly beneath the twisted roots of the living apple tree. Inside lay a single object, a small rosary, blackened with age. When Dr. Hart reached out to lift it, every light in the chamber flickered. A wind, though no door was open, rushed through the tunnel, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. The generator above ground failed. The lanterns died one by one. In the sudden dark, someone screamed. When the lights returned, one of the students, Mara Lee, was gone. They searched the tunnels for hours, but she had simply vanished. No footprints, no torn fabric, nothing. That night, Dr. Hart sat outside the chapel, staring at the lone apple tree. Its branches moved, though the air was still. Beneath its bark, she thought she saw something pulse, slow and deliberate, like the rise and fall of breath. She didn't sleep. By dawn, they abandoned the site. The state declared the Harrowsfield ruins unstable and sealed the area again. The files from Dr. Hart's expedition were archived under restricted access. But a year later, she received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a Polaroid photograph, grainy, overexposed. It showed the chapel interior, the apple tree, and standing beside it, barely visible, the faint outline of a woman in white holding a child. On the back, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "He walks again." Dr. Hart left academia soon after. Her colleagues said she became obsessed, collecting church records, witness accounts, and local folklore. She traveled repeatedly to Rome, petitioning the Vatican for access to sealed documents related to the Harrowsfield anomaly. They denied her every time. Then, in 1996, she vanished. Her apartment was found empty, except for a single tape recorder left running beside her bed. The tape contained 2 hours of silence, until the final minute. A woman's voice, soft and distant, whispered, "Fiat." And then, faintly, the sound of a child laughing. For decades, nothing more was said. Harrowsfield faded back into shadow. Until 2003. A storm caused a landslide near the old Convent hill, exposing part of the underground vault. When local authorities arrived to assess the damage, they discovered human remains, hundreds of them, packed together beneath the chapel floor. At first, they assumed it was an old burial ground. But the bones were wrong. They were small, too small, each set belonging to an infant. Some still bore remnants of linen wrappings, each marked with the same sigil, a sunburst with 12 rays. The state coroner recorded the discovery as historical anomaly, possible infant cemetery, but one of the attending officers, Deputy Lawrence Keene, kept his own notes. Keene was the great-great-grandson of Dr. Josiah Keene, the 19th century doctor who had examined Sister Agnes. Family stories had haunted him since childhood, and when he stood in that vault, staring at the endless rows of infant bones, he understood what his ancestor had meant when he wrote, "Nature has bent to her will." In an interview years later, Keene said quietly, "They weren't buried. They were arranged, every one of them facing east toward the morning." The press never heard the full story. The church intervened again, claiming historical oversight and taking possession of all evidence. But word leaked out through a former forensic technician. She described one final, horrifying detail. Among the remains was one skeleton that didn't match the rest, larger, almost adult, but twisted, malformed. Its skull bore 2 small indentations above the brow, as if something had pressed there repeatedly during life. And beneath its rib cage lay a smaller skeleton, curled like a child in its mother's arms. They were buried together. When the Vatican's representative arrived, a cardinal named Sebastiano Conti, he ordered immediate reburial and exorcism rites. But one night, a local worker, against orders, opened the sealed reliquary. Inside was a folded letter. It was written in French. The ink was brown with age. "If he returns, do not call him by name. The light is not what saves us. It is what consumes. Pray for the shadows, for they are the only things that remember mercy. A. Thibault." That night the reliquary was sealed again. And yet, those who attended the ceremony claimed the ground trembled as they filled the grave. Some swore the air itself shimmered, as though heat rose from the soil. One priest fainted. Another refused to speak of it again. There are tapes of that day, archival recordings made by the diocese. You can still hear the chanting, the murmurs, the Latin hymns echoing through the ruined chapel. But if you listen closely, beneath the voices you can hear something else. A heartbeat. Slow, heavy, persistent, as if the earth itself were breathing. Months later, Cardinal Conti returned to Rome. Within a year, he was dead. Officially, cardiac arrest. But a rumor spread among the clergy that his final words, spoken to his confessor, were, "The child is awake." And now, a century and a half since Sister Agnes lay in that cellar, her legend endures not as a parable of sin, but as something more sinister, a lingering pulse beneath the skin of faith itself. Because what began as the scandal of a nun and a slave became something else entirely, an infection of belief. Agnes believed herself divine. Elias believed her. And belief, once given shape, has a way of surviving long after its makers are dust. The Church tried to bury it, but you cannot bury faith. Not when it has learned how to breathe. Some nights, when storms pass over that valley, locals still report a strange light glowing through the clouds. White, unwavering, too high to be fire. Those who live closest to the hills say their livestock grow restless. Their children wake screaming with words they've never heard before. One woman, a descendant of the Thibault line, wrote in her diary in 2014, "He came to me in the orchard. His eyes were like mirrors. He said, 'My mother was the first light. I am the last.'" Her entry ended mid-sentence. She disappeared 2 days later. So what then was born in that convent cellar in 1847? Was it madness? The delusion of a lonely nun and her servant caught in the web of their own forbidden devotion? Or was it something far worse, something that used faith as its cradle? Maybe Agnes didn't bring forth a child of God at all. Maybe she gave birth to faith itself, to the raw, untamed hunger for meaning that drives us to call anything miraculous when it defies our fear. Faith without God is a dangerous thing. It needs no altar, no scripture, only believers. And believers are easy to find. If you stood in that room, beneath the chapel, beneath the roots of that black tree, and heard that heartbeat echo through the stone, would you call it a crime or a sacrifice? Would you see a woman damned or a mother divine? Leave your answer below. The Vatican keeps many secrets, but some refuse to stay hidden. In 2017, a cache of restricted church documents was leaked by an anonymous archivist. Among the files were scans labeled SEC Harrowsfield Case Internal Memoranda, 1848-1996. The contents were a labyrinth of confession transcripts, field reports, and exorcism logs. For most, it read like bureaucratic Latin and dust. But tucked between the pages was something far stranger. A handwritten account by Father Antonius Calvi, the Jesuit inquisitor who had vanished from St. Catherine's in 1847. The letter had never been filed. It was addressed not to the church, but to someone he called Frater Lucien, the priest who'd once begged to expose the scandal. It began simply, "Brother, I have seen the womb of light, and it does not bear salvation." What followed was a confession, not of sin, but of revelation. Antonius described descending into the convent's lower vault on his final night. He claimed Sister Agnes had summoned him there, saying the hour of birth had come again. He found her kneeling beside a pool of stagnant water, her white habit stained dark. The infant, Emmanuel, was beside her, silent, eyes open. She told me the child no longer needed breath, for he had taken his first in heaven. His veins shone faintly beneath his skin, as though a fire burned within. I commanded her to cease her blasphemy. She only smiled. He wrote that the water began to ripple, though no wind stirred. A voice, soft, genderless, spoke from it. "The blood remembers." Then the light came, not holy, not blinding, but alive. It crept along the stone walls, threading through the cracks like veins. It touched the child first, Antonius wrote, and I saw his eyes turn from gray to silver. Then it reached the mother, and she gasped as though struck by ecstasy or terror. I could not tell which. In his final paragraph, the priest admitted he tried to kill them both. He drew his crucifix and plunged it into the water, shouting prayers until his throat tore. The light recoiled, but not before it spoke his name. I fled, yet when I looked back, the woman was standing. She held the child to her breast, her body bleeding from a wound no man had made. She said, "Do not fear, Father. The Lord needs no church to be reborn." The letter ended with a final line, written in shaky script. "If this reaches you, burn it, and never pray in the dark." No one knows how that letter survived. Some say Lucien recovered it before his disappearance. Others say it was copied by the Church to keep as proof of divine, or infernal, intervention. Whatever its origin, it changed how investigators viewed the case. Because if Antonius Calvi's words were true, the events at St. Catherine's were not merely human sin, but the beginning of something far larger, something that blurred the line between miracle and contagion. Rome, 1973. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the modern descendant of the Inquisition, reopened the Harrowsfield file. The Vatican scientists had begun collecting data on unexplained phenomena reported near former convent lands: power surges, spontaneous electrical fires, erratic magnetic readings. They believed something remained buried beneath the hill. Internal memos spoke of luminous disturbances and persistent biological resonance. In one classified note, a cardinal warned, "If this is a relic, it is not of divine order. The field it emits responds to emotion, especially fear." They called it the Agnes phenomenon. The team sent to investigate included physicists, theologians, and one young Jesuit linguist, Father Matteo Silvestri, whose curiosity would later destroy him. Silvestri's field diary, smuggled out years later, recounts their final days in Harrowsfield. "We set up instruments in the old chapel remains. The equipment behaves erratically, as if something interferes with magnetism. At night we hear what sounds like voices underground. Sometimes they form words, sometimes only hums. The locals refuse to approach after dusk." By the fourth night, Silvestri claimed to have seen a radiance moving through the orchard, human in shape but shifting like smoke. He described a second figure, a child, standing beside it. "They do not walk," he wrote. "They unfold." Then came the entry that ended the journal. I asked aloud, "Who are you?" And a voice replied, "We are what you begged for." The next morning, half the team was gone. Their camp was found undisturbed, save for the soil, everywhere disturbed, as though something had crawled beneath it. Silvestri was found wandering 10 miles away, barefoot, clutching a rosary made of apple seeds strung together with wire. He died within a week, whispering Agnes's name until his lungs gave out. The Vatican sealed Harrowsfield for the final time. The surviving records were filed under Doctrinal Hazard Mater Lucis. And yet, something else was happening in Kentucky. Reports surfaced of children born under strange circumstances, babies with gray eyes and birthmarks shaped like sunbursts. One physician in Lexington recorded 3 such cases in 1975 alone. The mothers all claimed the same thing. They had dreamed of a woman in white who told them, "You will be blessed with light." Each child was born during a thunderstorm. Each grew without illness. Each was gone by age 12. In 1981, one of those mothers, Clara Bell, a schoolteacher, broke her silence. Her interview, recorded on cassette, remains one of the most disturbing first-hand accounts tied to the Harrowsfield legend. Her voice trembles through the static. "He never cried, not once. His eyes were too old. Sometimes I'd wake and find him standing at the window, staring toward the hills. I asked what he was looking at, and he said, "She's calling." When he turned 12, he told me I didn't have to worry anymore, that the others were ready. I thought he meant school friends, but that night lightning struck the orchard behind our house. The trees caught fire, and in the light I saw her. A woman, holding out her arms. He walked straight into the flames. The tape ends with Clara's sobs and the faint sound of wind chimes, though she owned none. Some believe the others her son spoke of were descendants, echoes of whatever walked out of St. Catherine's cellar that winter night in 1847. A bloodline born not of flesh, but of belief. Because belief, once set loose, reproduces. It spreads. It infects. Faith is not a disease, but it behaves like one. And perhaps Sister Agnes's greatest sin was not her body, but her certainty, the conviction that her vision was divine and therefore unassailable. If she was wrong, she created a contagion of conviction, each believer another carrier. And if she was right, then her child was not merely a child. He was the next revelation. In 2019, satellite scans of the Harrowsfield site detected unexplained electromagnetic pulses emanating from beneath the earth. No machinery exists there. The church requested the images be classified, but a whistleblower released one frame. It showed a faint circular outline beneath the hill, 40 meters across. At its center, a single tree-shaped shadow. Some say that black apple tree still lives, though it hasn't borne fruit in centuries. Others say the roots reach deeper than anyone imagines, and beneath them, something sleeps, waiting for spring. There is one final piece to this story. A fragment of a homily delivered in secret at the Vatican's underground chapel, date unknown. The speaker's identity was redacted. The words remain. The world calls it blasphemy, yet it was prophecy. The mother bore not a child, but a covenant. Light became flesh, and flesh remembered its maker. Do not pray for deliverance. Pray that the roots never break the surface. The transcript ends there, but one line, scrawled in the margin, reads, Fiat. Maybe this is why the Church never canonized Agnes as a heretic, nor exonerated her. To name her would be to acknowledge her. To bury her story would be to risk its resurrection. So, they keep her unspoken, sealed in dusty archives, while the faithful above ground continue to kneel in their sanctuaries, praying to a God who may no longer be listening. Because perhaps somewhere in that orchard soil, the line between heaven and hell blurred, and neither side noticed. Perhaps what was born in 1847 was neither miracle nor sin, but the first whisper of something that watched both and pitied them equally. When modern theologians discuss St. Catherine's, they call it the Kentucky Incarnation. The skeptics say it's a parable about repression and guilt, a metaphor for colonial sin. But the faithful, those few who still whisper Agnes's name during midnight prayers, believe she carried the first sign of a new world. Not a return of Christ, but the birth of something else entirely, the child of human belief, unbound by heaven or hell. And that child, they say, has never stopped walking. If you ever travel through central Kentucky, there's a stretch of road that bends sharply between two valleys. On misty mornings, drivers report seeing a figure in white walking along the shoulder, barefoot, carrying something swaddled. They say if you slow down, she turns, and her eyes, gray, almost silver, catch the light like mirrors. Then she whispers one word, Fiat, and your car stalls. Faith began the story. Faith ended it. And faith, like all hungers, always comes back. If you stood in that orchard, beneath that blackened tree, and saw her standing there, smiling, ageless, holding her silent child, would you bow? Would you run? Or would you too whisper, let it be done? Tell us in the comments. Would you call what happened in Harrowsfield divine punishment or divine proof? If you want us to keep unearthing America's forgotten horrors, the stories the church tried to erase, subscribe, like this video, and join the circle of those who still believe the truth sleeps beneath the soil. The scandal of St. Catherine's Convent never made front-page news. It lived quietly, in margins and footnotes, whispered between priests, buried in archives. But its shadow stretched far beyond that orchard hill, across decades, across oceans, across the thin veil separating the sacred from the human. The church called it contained. Historians called it apocryphal. But Harrowsfield soil had already done what faith could not. It remembered. By the dawn of the 20th century, the American Catholic Church had rewritten its account. In the chronicles of the Western dioceses, the convent was reduced to a footnote. In 1847, a minor scandal concerning the alleged misconduct of a nun led to the closure of St. Catherine's Convent in rural Kentucky. The matter was resolved internally. No mention of the child, no mention of Elias, no mention of the deaths. But silence, too, leaves fingerprints. In nearby towns, families whispered of the pale children. Priests reported an increase in confessions that began with the same phrase, "I dream of her." In 1909, a letter from Bishop Alaric Doucet of Louisville to the papal nuncio included this line: "Faith in the district is confused and feverish. Some parishioners speak of a female Christ, others of a child angel that walks by night. They claim to see light beneath the earth." The bishop called it hysteria. The church called it blasphemy. But neither could deny that something, belief, fear, maybe both, had taken root again. In secular circles, the Harrowsfield incident became a subject of fascination. Psychologists framed it as a case of mass hysteria. Feminists saw in Sister Agnes a symbol of female defiance, a woman who dared to reclaim divine power from a patriarchal order. In 1965, Professor Helen Wainwright published The Mother of Light, a feminist reinterpretation of the St. Catherine scandal. She argued that Agnes's miracle was not literal but metaphorical, a manifestation of suppressed autonomy under religious tyranny. Agnes's pregnancy, she wrote, represents the revolt of womanhood against centuries of imposed purity. The child of light is not a boy, but an idea, born of rebellion, baptized in secrecy. Her work earned both praise and condemnation. The Vatican labeled it profane scholarship, yet, quietly, copies of the book circulated in convent libraries worldwide. One nun, writing anonymously to Wainwright, confessed, "When I read her words, 'He is what remains when faith turns inside out,' I felt something awaken in me. Not fear, recognition." The letter bore no return address, but the postmark read, Harrowsfield, Kentucky. By the 21st century, St. Catherine's became legend. Paranormal investigators filmed documentaries. Urban explorers sneaked past the fences. They brought night vision cameras, EVP recorders, and bravado. Most left with nothing but eerie footage of moss and stone. But some brought back sounds, faint heartbeats, whispers, a lullaby that seemed to drift from beneath the ground. In 2009, a film crew spent 3 nights near the ruins. Their footage was never released. The only surviving clip, leaked anonymously online, shows the cameraman panning across the orchard. The trees appear bare. Then, as the microphone crackles, one branch trembles, and a voice says, "He's watching." The screen cuts to static. No crew member was ever identified. Yet, amid the myths, certain facts remain. The church's sealed archives on the Harrowsfield case still exist. Requests, To access them are denied under the clause for the preservation of the faithful. But leaked correspondence from 2004 between Vatican officials hints at something darker. The anomaly persists, one letter reads. Annual surveys detect irregular EM resonance beneath the site. Recommend continued containment. And in a handwritten note beneath, containment implies life. The legend now occupies a strange space, half folklore, half forbidden theology. In local sermons, priests warn against the imitation of divine light. In online forums, believers speak of the returning child. Some claim he's a man now, ageless, wandering. Others say he exists only when spoken of, reborn each time the story is told. Faith, after all, needs an audience. In the nearby town of Dry Hollow, a small roadside shrine still stands. No one knows who built it. It's nothing more than a wooden alcove with a single candle and an inscription carved into the frame. In Fiat. Visitors leave apples there, sometimes fresh, sometimes blackened by morning. Truckers passing on night routes say they see the flame from miles away, even when the candle's been extinguished. For the people who live near Harrowsfield, life goes on. Children walk to school. Farmers till the earth. But when storms roll in from the west, they still close their shutters. They say the thunder there sounds strange, not like the sky breaking, but like the slow, steady beat of a massive heart beneath the ground. If you open the archives of the Louisville Herald and look closely enough, you'll find one final mention of St. Catherine's, dated March 15, 1998, filed under obituaries. It reads, Hart, Evelyn. Dr. Evelyn Marie Hart, 47, Vanderbilt University, passed quietly at home. Survived by no immediate family. A memorial service will be held privately. Interred in Harrowsfield, Kentucky. No grave marker was ever found. And so, the story of St. Catherine's Convent fades again into rumor. But every generation, someone rediscovers it. A scholar, a skeptic, a believer. Each thinking they can separate myth from truth. Yet, the deeper they dig, the more the story becomes a mirror. A nun and her forbidden love. A child born of faith and transgression. A church that feared its own reflection. Maybe the miracle was never divine. Maybe it was simply human, the terrifying power of belief to make anything, even horror, holy. And maybe that's why the earth never forgets. Today, the ruins of St. Catherine's are overgrown. The air smells of wet stone and apple rot. The black tree still stands, its trunk split, its roots tangled deep into the crypt where Agnes once prayed. If you stand beneath it at night, the wind through its branches sounds almost like whispering. Some say it speaks the same words Sister Agnes spoke on her deathbed. He is not mine. He belongs to the light. And somewhere in that orchard darkness, you might think you hear the faint cry of a child. But listen longer. It's not crying. It's breathing. So what do you believe? Was Sister Agnes Thibault a heretic driven by guilt and isolation, or a prophet who glimpsed something the Church was never meant to understand? Was the child she carried flesh and signor light given shape by faith too desperate to die? Perhaps Harrowsfield was never cursed at all. Perhaps it simply became what every holy place eventually becomes, a mirror reflecting the hunger that built it. And maybe, as long as one believer still whispers, Fiat, into the dark, the story of St. Catherine's isn't over. It's just waiting to begin again. If you've followed this far into the shadows, if you've listened for the heartbeat beneath the hymns, tell us what you think. Was this truth unveiled, or buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. And if you want us to keep unearthing America's darkest history, Like this video and subscribe for next week's story because some secrets don't rest quietly, and neither